The red dust of Prime covered everything, stood at the edge of the research outpost and watched the horizon. The sky was already changing color. In a few hours, the sun would sink below the far mountains and the temperature would drop fast. Had seen many worlds, but he knew that Prime was different. It was harder than most. It was meaner. Behind him, the main outpost structure was nearly complete. Large metal walls formed a rectangle, strong and smooth. Solar panels sat on the roof, catching the thin light. The Galactic Council had approved the design. The automated construction machines had built it according to the plans. Everything was by the rules. Did not trust rules that did not account for what could go wrong. He turned away from the horizon and walked back toward the center of the outpost. His boots left prints in the red sand. The wind would erase them by tomorrow. Everything was temporary here. Everything needed to be ready for change. Was in the main laboratory when entered. The Vex scientist was tall and thin, with skin that looked like polished blue stone. He had been studying the rock samples they had collected that morning. He looked up when came through the door. "Captain," said, his voice calm and smooth. "We have found something interesting in the geological layers. This planet had significant water activity perhaps 2 million years ago. The desert now, but water once." Nodded, he knew this already. The geological reports had told them this. But he listened anyway. Liked to explain things. It made him feel important. "That means weather patterns changed," said, "fast." Made a sound that was like a laugh. "Humans always think in terms of disaster. The water left. The climate changed. Now it is stable. The patterns are predictable. Our instruments measure everything. We will know if anything dangerous happens." Did not argue. He had learned not to argue with. The scientist had made it clear that he thought humans were outdated. That human thinking was too focused on fear. That the Galactic Council had only included humans on this mission because Earth was a founding member, not because humans had anything useful to offer. Was in the equipment section, checking the power systems. She was with 4 arms and a body that moved like water. She was one of the better engineers. She was practical. But she also believed in the technology. She had to. Her entire species was built on technology. "The secondary structure," said when she saw, she made a sound like a laugh. "You are still thinking about this? Captain, the main outpost is solid. The automatic systems will handle any problem. Why do you want to waste time and materials on a second shelter?" "Because the instruments might fail," said simply. "Because weather prediction is not always right. Because things that should not happen sometimes do." "That is human thinking," said. She moved 2 of her arms in a gesture of dismissal. "Always preparing for what will not occur, always afraid." Said nothing. He had learned that sometimes saying nothing was better than trying to explain. Did not understand because her people had never faced what humans faced. The Vex had left their home world thousands of years ago. They had advanced their technology to the point where nature was no longer a threat. They did not remember what it meant to live on a world that tried to kill you every single day. But remembered, Earth had taught him that. Earth had taught every human that. That afternoon began his work. The site he had chosen was about 200 meters from the main outpost. It was on higher ground. There was a large rock formation there, natural stone already shaped by millions of years of wind and sand. Used simple tools and local materials. He reinforced the natural shelter with stone blocks he had cut from the nearby formations. He built walls that followed the natural curves of the rock. He positioned everything so that wind would not push directly against the structure. The work was hard. The gravity on Prime was different than Earth. His body felt heavier, but had done hard work before. He had been a soldier. He had been an explorer. Hard work was something he understood. By the 3rd day and came to watch him work. They stood in the red sand and looked at the structure was building. It was simple. It was crude compared to the metal walls and automated systems of the main outpost. But it was solid. It was made from the planet itself. "This is like a cave," said. "This is what your ancestors built millions of years ago, before civilization." "Yes," said. He did not stop working. "Caves work. My ancestors survived in caves because caves are strong, because the planet itself protects you." "But we have better methods now," said. "We have technology, we have prediction, we have systems that respond to threat. Why would we go backward to primitive shelter?" Set down his tools. He looked at both of them. "Because sometimes the planet does not care about your technology. Sometimes the planet does just what it wants, and the old ways are the only ways that survive." Made his laugh sound again. You think the desert will test us. You think Prime will try to kill us. Captain, this world is stable. This world is measured. Your fear is not useful here. Did not answer. He picked up his tools again and went back to work. The sun was beginning to move toward the western mountains. The light was changing. In a few hours, it would be dark. In the darkness, the wind always got stronger on Prime. He worked through the evening. He worked as the stars came out. The shelter was nearly done. The stone walls were nearly complete. He had built it in a way that the wind would slide over it, would flow around it like water around a rock in a river. He had built it in a way that sand would not pile against the walls. He had built it in a way that would let the planet rage outside while everything inside stayed safe. By the time finished, the red sky had turned to black. The stars above were hard and bright. The temperature had dropped so far that he could see his breath. He stood inside his finished shelter and looked at the work. It was good work. It was human work. It was the work of a species that lived on a hard world and learned how to survive. The next morning went back to the main outpost, and then the other scientists were already awake. They were studying the new weather readings. The instruments were picking up changes in the atmospheric pressure, changes in the wind patterns. Interesting, said, looking at the data. A storm system is forming. It is significant but manageable. The outpost will handle it easily. Looked at the readings over his shoulder. The numbers told him something different. The barometric pressure was dropping too fast. The temperature was changing in the wrong way. The wind readings were not following normal patterns. But said nothing. He had learned not to argue with. He only wondered how long it would be before understood that sometimes the planet did exactly what humans. The weather changed faster than anyone expected. By noon of the next day, the barometric pressure had dropped so far that the instruments were giving new readings every few minutes. The wind speed was increasing. The temperature was dropping. The sky was turning from red to dark orange to brown. Went to the control room where and the other scientists were gathered around the monitoring screens. The numbers on the display were clear. This was not a normal storm. This was something bigger. We need to move the sensitive equipment, said. We need to seal the main structure. We need to prepare for serious conditions. Looked at him with an expression that showed no concern. The instruments tell us the storm will pass. The outpost was built to withstand wind speeds up to 240 kilometers per hour. The prediction shows peak speeds of 180. We are safe. Predictions are not always right, said. He kept his voice steady. He had learned how to make his point without showing anger. The instruments might be reading the system wrong. The storm could be worse than they show. Came over to look at the data. She studied the screens for a long moment. Then she made a gesture with two of her arms that meant disagreement. The equipment is functioning properly. We have tested it thoroughly. The outpost is strong. Captain, I understand that humans worry about survival. It is in your nature, but this is not the time to let fear control decisions. This is not fear, said. This is experience. Earth has taught humans what storms can do. I have seen what happens when you do not prepare. I have seen people die because they did not take the danger seriously. Stood up, his tall form seemed to make the room feel smaller. Earth is a harsh world. Humans lived there because they had no choice. But we are not on Earth. We are here on Prime, with instruments, with technology, with science. These things are more reliable than human instinct. Wanted to say more? He wanted to explain that human instinct had kept humans alive on Earth for thousands of years. That instinct was not weakness. But he could see that it was not the time, had made his decision. The other scientists agreed with him. They trusted their instruments. They trusted their technology. They did not trust human fear. He turned and left the control room. The rest of the day was spent watching the storm grow larger. By late afternoon, the wind was strong enough to make the metal walls of the outpost vibrate. The sound was low and deep, like a warning. The sky was nearly black now. Lightning was showing in the distance. The sand on the ground was beginning to move in waves. When I find Vex, the young researcher had worked with him on several projects. Vex was different from. Vex listened to what said. Vex did not dismiss his ideas just because they came from a human. He found Vex in the sample storage area, carefully securing the collected rock and soil samples. The storm will be bad, Vex said without looking up. I have studied the ancient rock layers like showed us. There is evidence that massive storms have occurred here many times. The erosion patterns show it clearly. Does not want to hear it, said. Vex stopped working and turned to look at. The had 4 eyes. When all four eyes focused on something, it meant complete attention. Believes in measurement. He believes in numbers, but numbers do not show everything. Numbers do not show fear, and I think the planet is showing fear. Nodded. This was why he liked Vex. The young researcher could think beyond the data. I need to move critical equipment and data, said. I need to move it to the secondary shelter I built, but I need authorization and will not give it. Vex was quiet for a moment. Then they came to a decision. I will help you. I will tell that you are following standard maintenance protocol, that moving the most valuable data to backup storage is normal procedure. It was a small deception, but it was necessary. That evening, and Vex began moving things, the most important equipment, the data that could not be recovered, the samples that represented months of research. They carried everything across the open ground between the main outpost and the stone shelter had built. The wind was already pulling at them. The red sand was moving now, swirling in patterns that made it hard to see more than a few meters, and Vex made multiple trips. By the time the work was nearly done, the light was almost gone. The sky was completely dark. The only light came from lightning flashing in the clouds above. Other researchers began to notice what was happening. Some came to help. Others went back to report what was doing. Did not stop. He kept working. He kept moving the important things to the shelter that everyone had laughed about just days before. By the time night fell, had done what he could. The most critical data was safe. The most valuable samples were in the stone shelter. The most important equipment was protected. He had done everything that his experience and his knowledge of dangerous worlds could tell him to do. At midnight, he stood inside the main outpost and looked out at the darkness. He could not see the stone shelter anymore. He could not see anything beyond the outer walls. The wind was so loud now that it was hard to hear anything else. The lights in the outpost flickered. The power systems were beginning to strain. Came to stand next to him. The scientist looked worried now. His confidence was beginning to crack. The reality of what was happening was becoming hard to deny. You were right, said quietly. The instruments were wrong, or the storm is different than what they predicted. Said nothing. There was no point in saying he had been right. Being right did not matter now. What mattered was surviving. What mattered was getting everyone through the night. We need to move people, said. We need to move them to the secondary shelter. It is small, but it will hold. The main outpost will not. Looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Then the scientist nodded. I will tell them to listen to you. By 1 o'clock in the morning, everyone was preparing to move. The storm was hitting the outpost now with full force. The metal walls were shaking. The sound was like standing inside a machine that was tearing itself apart. The lights went out. The backup power came on. The instruments went dark. Began organizing the evacuation. He told people to take only what they could carry. He told them to follow him. He told them to trust him. He told them that the shelter would be small and crowded, but it would be strong. The wind outside was beyond anything that could be described. It was not just wind, it was something else. It was the planet trying to destroy everything that had been built. It was nature showing what it could do when humans forgot to respect it. The moment they stepped outside, the wind knocked the first researcher backward, caught him and held him steady. The sand was not like sand anymore. It was like millions of tiny bullets traveling at high speed. It cut exposed skin. It filled the air so completely that breathing was difficult. Had wrapped cloth around his head and face. He had given similar cloth to the others before they left. It was not perfect protection, but it was better than nothing. He held up his hand and made a signal that meant follow me. Then he began moving toward the secondary shelter. The distance was only 200 meters, but it felt like kilometers. The wind was trying to blow them backward. The sand was hitting them from all directions. Every step was a battle against the force of the storm. Moved forward step by step, and he did not allow himself to think about failure. He did not allow himself to think about what would happen if they did not make it to the shelter. Behind him, the others followed. Came next, holding tight to a rope that had tied between them, was moving her forearms to help keep her balance. Vex was helping one of the younger researchers, a human named who had never experienced a storm like this. There were 7 others, all scientists, all workers at the outpost. The entrance to the stone shelter was open and waiting. Had left it that way because he knew that closing doors in a storm like this would be difficult. They stumbled through, one by one, fighting against the wind the entire way. One of the older Vex researchers, a scientist named, did not make it with the first group. He had been helping a younger carry equipment. When looked back after getting the first people inside, he could not see them anymore. The sand had become so thick that visibility was almost zero. Made a decision instantly. He tied a rope to his waist. He gave the other end to and told her to hold it tight, then he stepped back into the storm. The wind was stronger now. It had intensified since they arrived at the shelter. It was not just wind anymore. It was something alive, something that wanted to hurt them. Moved forward, keeping the shelter behind him. He swept his arm through the air, calling out. His voice was completely lost in the roar of the wind. Then he felt something solid. A body, a person, grabbed hold and pulled. It was the older scientist had fallen and could not find his way back. The sand had covered him. He was on the edge of unconsciousness. Behind was the younger, still trying to help him move, grabbed both of them. They were heavy. The wind was trying to push them away from the shelter, but had lived on a harsh world. His body was used to fighting against conditions that wanted to kill him. He pulled them backward toward where he knew the shelter was, even though he could not see it. The rope was still attached to his waist. He followed the rope like it was his lifeline, because it was his lifeline. He felt the solid stone of the shelter entrance. He pulled and the younger through the opening. All three of them fell onto the floor of the shelter. Behind them, the wind screamed like an animal. Inside, everyone was pressed against the stone walls. The shelter was not large. It was crowded with 13 people now, all of them breathing hard, all of them frightened. But they were alive. They were safe. Outside, the storm had not stopped. It had become worse. The wind was shaking the shelter itself. Dust and sand were finding their way through cracks in the stone. Could hear sounds that should not exist. The sound of metal being torn. The sound of the main outpost being destroyed. He moved to the back of the shelter where he had stored supplies. Water, food, medical equipment, breathing masks with filters. He had known that the shelter would need to hold people for more than a few hours. He had known what a real storm could do. Vex helped him distribute the masks and water. The young's 4 eyes showed trust now. No doubt. The shelter had proven itself, and Vex had proven that at least one alien researcher could think like a human who understood danger. Sat against the stone wall and looked at. The scientist's face showed something that looked like shame. We should have listened. We should have believed you. Did not waste time on blame. We are here now. We are safe. That is what matters. But outside, the storm was showing them what it could do. The wind was hitting the shelter with such force that they could feel it through the stone. The sound was constant and terrifying. It was the sound of a planet that had decided to test them, and they had nothing but stone and human foresight between them and death. The young human researcher was shaking, not from cold but from fear, sat down next to him and spoke quietly. This happened on Earth many times. Humans survived because we build strong shelters, because we think about what could go wrong, because we prepare. We are going to survive this too. The words seemed to help. The young human nodded and managed to slow his breathing. The storm did not end. It continued through the night and into the next day without stopping. The wind showed no sign of weakness. The sand continued to bombard the shelter with the force of bullets. The temperature inside dropped as the storm pulled heat away from the stone. People huddled together for warmth. Managed the supplies with careful precision. He measured out water in exact amounts, not too much to waste, not too little to cause dehydration. He distributed food slowly, knowing that the storm might last longer than anyone expected. He had been trained as a military officer. He had been trained to keep people alive when resources were limited. He used everything that training had taught him. By midnight, one of the researchers began to feel sick. It was a young Vex named. The scientist had been breathing the filtered air, but sand had gotten into her system somehow. Her temperature was rising. Her breathing was becoming difficult. Checked her thoroughly. He used the medical equipment he had brought. He found a small wound on her shoulder where sand had cut her when they were running to the shelter. The wound was infected. On Prime, the bacteria in the sand was aggressive. In a warm environment like a living body, it could spread fast. The other scientists watched him work. They saw how knew exactly what to do. He cleaned the wound carefully. He applied antibiotics that he had brought to the shelter. He gave medicine to lower her fever. He set up a system to monitor her condition. All of this he did without panic. All of this he did like someone who had handled medical emergencies many times before. "How do you know how to do this?" asked him. "You are a military officer, not a doctor." "Humans on Earth learn many skills," said, not looking up from his work. Because humans live on a dangerous world, everyone learns how to survive, how to help others, how to think beyond their one job. It is the human way. His condition improved slowly through the night, checked on her every hour. He made sure she was hydrated. He made sure the medicine was working. By early morning, her fever had come down. She was breathing easier. She would live. Watched all of this and made a realization. He sat down next to during the long hours before dawn. You knew this would happen, the Vex scientist said quietly. You knew the shelter would be needed. You prepared not just the structure, but supplies and medicine and everything. You prepared like you were preparing for death. No, said. I prepared for survival. There is a difference. Death is what happens when you do not prepare. Survival is what happens when you do. But how could you know, pressed? How could you be so certain? Looked at the scientist. Because I have studied history, because I have read about storms that destroyed worlds, because I have learned from humans who came before me, because Earth taught me that the planet will always do what the planet will do, and humans must respect that or die. The next day, the storm was still raging, but something had changed. The power seemed slightly less intense. The sound of the wind was still loud, but not quite as overwhelming. Checked the cracks in the stone, still sealed tight. The shelter was holding perfectly. Inside the shelter, people were running out of space. 13 bodies in a small stone room meant there was barely any place to move. But no one complained, because outside they could hear the sound of destruction, the sound of the main outpost being torn apart by the storm. Tried to check the communication system, but the electromagnetic noise from the storm was too strong. The signals were scrambled. They could not call for help. They could not tell anyone where they were. They were completely alone on this harsh planet, in a simple stone shelter, waiting for a storm to end. It was during this time that something important happened. The young human researcher who had been frightened began to understand. He began to see that preparation was not paranoia. It was wisdom. It was the kind of thinking that had kept humans alive through millions of years of evolution on a world that tried to kill them. How many times have you been in situations like this? Asked. Not like this, said. Prime is new, but I have been in enough dangerous situations to know that preparation is always worth the effort. On Earth, we have storms called hurricanes. We have earthquakes. We have floods. Humans learned thousands of years ago that getting ready for these things is not something to feel stupid about. It is something to do. By the second day, the wind was clearly beginning to weaken. It was still strong. It was still dangerous. But it was not the overwhelming force it had been. The barometric pressure readings on one of their portable instruments showed that the storm was finally moving. Began to ration the supplies differently. There was still water, still food, but they could eat slightly more now because it was clear they would survive. The immediate danger was passing. What will happen when we get out? Vex asked. What will happen to the research? The research will be delayed, said. The outpost will need to be rebuilt, but we will be alive. That is more important than any research. And did not argue. They had learned their lesson. They had learned that all the technology in the galaxy meant nothing when nature decided to show its power. They had learned that humans were not backward. Humans were wise. Humans had learned how to think about survival because survival was never guaranteed on Earth. The storm ended during the morning of the third day. The wind died down to something that was almost normal. The sand stopped moving in waves. The sky began to brighten. The color changed from black back to dark orange, and then eventually to the red that was normal for Prime. Was the first to step outside. The landscape had been completely transformed. The red dust was deeper now, covering everything. The main outpost in the distance was barely recognizable. The metal walls were torn and bent. Solar panels were scattered across the ground like broken toys. The structure that had been built according to Galactic Council standards was destroyed. But the stone shelter stood. It was exactly where it had been built. A few surfaces showed the marks of the sand hitting at high speed, but the basic structure was intact and strong. The angles that had designed held up perfectly. The walls that had been built from the planet itself had proven superior to any technology. The others came out one by one. They looked at the devastation. They looked at the destroyed outpost. They looked at the shelter that had saved them. No one said anything at first. There was nothing to say. The evidence was clear. Came out last, still weak from her infection, but recovering well. She stood next to and looked at the destroyed main building. Humans built this? She asked, pointing at the stone shelter. Yes, said simply. It is not beautiful, said. It is not advanced. It is not impressive by the standards of my people. No, agreed. It is just strong. It is just practical. It is just designed to keep people alive. Over the next few hours, they began salvaging what they could from the main outpost. The equipment was damaged beyond repair. The advanced systems were destroyed, but some of the supplies were still usable, and crucially, the data that had moved to the stone shelter was completely intact and safe. Then the rescue ships arrived. They came from the orbital station that was above Prime. The pilots were shocked by what they found. One of the most advanced research outposts ever built, torn to pieces by a storm. But 13 people alive, 13 people safe, 13 people who had survived because of a human captain and a stone shelter. The rescue team leader was a Vex named. He looked at the destruction and then looked at. "What happened here?" he asked. Explained. He explained about the storm, about the warning that had been dismissed, about the secondary shelter that had been built before the storm came, about how everything that had been built according to advanced technology had failed, and everything that had been built from simple stone and human wisdom had survived. Listened carefully. Then he said, "The Galactic Council will need to know about this. This changes things." Back in the rescue ship, as they were being transported to safety, approached. The Vex scientist looked uncomfortable. He looked like someone who needed to say something difficult. "I was wrong," said. "I was certain that my knowledge was complete. I was certain that human fear was outdated. I was wrong about all of this." "You were wrong about the danger," said. "But that is okay. Now you know, now you have experienced it. That is how learning works. That is how every species learns." Came to talk to later. The engineer had spent time calculating the forces that the storm had created. The wind speeds, the sand particle velocity, the structural pressures. "The shelter is more efficient than modern outpost design," she said, studying her data. "It is lighter, it uses less resources, and it is stronger, much stronger. I think the Galactic Council will want to change the building standards for hostile planets." "Maybe," said. "Or maybe they will ignore the lesson and build the same way next time. That is also how some species learn, through repeated failure." But Vex was different. The young researcher came to find before they left the planet's surface. "What impressed me most," Vex said, "was not that you were right about the shelter. It was how you acted after you were proven right. You did not claim victory. You did not make the others feel stupid. You only worked to save them. You only did what needed to be done." Smiled. It was the first time he had smiled since the storm began. "That is what humans do. We do not have the luxury of anger when someone is in danger. We only have the responsibility to help." The journey back to the orbital station took 6 hours. By the time they arrived, the story of the Sandstorm had already spread through the scientific community. By the time they reached the Galactic Council hearing station, the story had spread through the entire sector. A human captain had prepared for danger that the best instruments said would not be dangerous. A human captain had built a shelter that everyone had thought was useless. A human captain had saved a multi-species team of researchers by thinking like a human. By thinking like someone who had evolved on a world that had tried to kill his species every single day for millions of years. The Galactic Council held a formal hearing, and they both admitted that they had ignored warnings. They both admitted that their instruments had been wrong. They both admitted that the shelter had saved their lives, but the most important testimony came from Vex. The young researcher stood before the council and spoke clearly. "Humans are not backward. Humans think differently because they evolved differently. They think about survival because on Earth, survival is never guaranteed. They prepare for the worst because the worst has happened to their species many times. And when I was afraid and uncertain, Captain did not let me down. He did not hesitate. He did not claim to be better than us. He only saved us." The council voted to change the building standards for all outposts on hostile worlds. They voted to consult human expertise when building on dangerous planets. They voted to acknowledge that different ways of thinking could be valuable. Different ways of thinking could save lives. 3 months later stood in the rebuilt outpost. The new structure used elements of both advanced technology and human-designed practical shelter. It was stronger than the original. It was safer. It combined the best of both ways of thinking. Brought the plans to him. "It is better," she said. "Your way and our way, together they are better than either one alone." "Yes," agreed. "That is the way of the galaxy. Different peoples, different skills, different ways of thinking. When we respect each other, we get better results." In the distance, the stone shelter that had built still stood. It had been left where it was. It had become a monument to human wisdom, a monument to preparation, a monument to the idea that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. Sometimes the simple solutions were the strongest solutions. Sometimes respect for the planet was the thing you could do. And the human captain that everyone had dismissed was finally recognized for what he was. Not paranoid, not backward, just wise. Just someone who understood that humans had learned their lessons on a hard world. Lessons that could save lives on any world if other species were willing to listen. The red sun of Prime set over the horizon. Inside the new outpost, the researchers continued their work. And outside, the stone shelter stood guard, a reminder that human preparation had proven itself once again. That respect for danger was not weakness. That thinking about survival was not paranoia. That humans, for all their differences, had something valuable to teach the galaxy. They had learned how to survive. As the second night came, the wind was clearly much weaker. The sound of the storm was not the roar of a living creature anymore. It was just wind, just sand, just weather. The immediate danger had passed. Inside the shelter, people began to rest more easily, was recovering well. The younger researchers who had been frightened were beginning to feel safe. And the human captain that everyone had dismissed sat quietly and watched over them all. He thought about Earth. He thought about the storms he had experienced there. He thought about how humans had learned to survive on the harshest world in the known galaxy. And he knew that humans would survive on Prime too, because humans did not give up. Because humans prepared. Because humans understood something that the advanced species had forgotten. They understood that respect for nature was not weakness, it was strength. Hours passed. The shelter held. The stone walls absorbed the force of the wind. The angles of the structure that had carefully planned worked exactly as he had imagined they would. The wind flowed over and around the shelter instead of hitting it directly. The sand did not pile against the walls because it had built them in a way that let sand move past. In the main outpost, the metal walls were not surviving so well. The advanced construction had been designed for protection, but it had been designed by minds that did not think like humans. Minds that did not understand that sometimes the simple way was the best way. The metal was bending. The seals were failing. The technology was overloading under conditions that the engineers had said were impossible. But inside the stone shelter, 13 people were alive. And as the night wore on, as the storm continued to rage with a force that seemed endless, they began to understand something fundamental. They began to understand that humans had evolved on a world that tried to kill them every single day. And humans had learned to survive because survival was the only option. Sat quietly and watched over them all. His shelter held, the stone held, the human way held, and outside the sandstorm of Prime showed no sign of stopping. The captain that everyone had dismissed as paranoid and afraid opened the door to the darkness, and he led them toward the shelter that he had built with his own hands, the shelter that everyone had called a joke, the shelter that was about to save their lives. It would do. Sometimes the old fears were the wise fears. Sometimes the human way was the right way. Looked out the window at the red horizon. It was already beginning to change color. The sky was turning darker, the storm was coming, and this time was ready.